Please be seated. What a good morning it is. It's good to see you this morning. It's good to sing these songs of praise to God. And as I look out into the audience, I see a really, really blessed congregation. And we're really thankful for what God is doing and has done. This is going to turn into a series, and I actually decided that just a little bit ago, but I kind of just wanted to start off preaching a sermon on seeing as Jesus sees, and then something hit me this morning. I said, this is a series. So there's just a lot of things on my mind with this, so you might expect this for the next few weeks. But the lens that you're looking through, and I'm not talking about your glasses, the lens that you're looking through is skewed. And it's not just how you look in the mirror and look at yourself, it's also in how you observe people and people around you. For example, I may place a lot of expectations on other people and then realize I don't place those same expectations on myself. And don't you hate that when you're like, oh, what? I'm forcing things or I'm placing things on other people that I'm unwilling to do. That's so Pharisaic, and I don't want to be that way. And Jesus asked his disciples in Mark 8:18, they couldn't see the bread. They're talking about feeding the 5,000, and Jesus asked them, do you have eyes but fail to see? Do you have eyes, he says, but fail to see in Mark 8 and verse 18. Sometimes we're the only ones that, we think we can see this and this and this, or we think that those people, well, they actually see the least when they might see the most, or vice versa. In John 9, I was outlining kind of in my mind and here in the text all the passages, all the scriptures, about seeing in verse 4, as long as it is day. And here he sees a man who is blind from birth. And they asked, is his parents' sin? Is that why he's blind? And this whole discussion in this chapter. In verse 4, as long as it is the day. In verse 5, he says, I am the light of the world. In verse 6, he says, and applied the clay to his eyes, or go wash in the pool of Siloam, and he came back seeing. And then in verse 10, he says, how were your eyes opened, they ask. In verse 11, he says, I received sight. You think about everything associated with sight and seeing. And the Pharisees, they didn't believe what they saw about a man who is now seeing. That's kind of funny. But in verse 18, the Jews didn't believe what they were seeing about a man who was born blind. And his parents say, well, he's of age, ask him. And then in verse 32, it has never been heard, that's funny too, that anyone has opened the eyes of a man born blind. And then in verse 37, Jesus says, you both see him, and he is the one who is talking to you. And in verse 39, Jesus says, those who do not may see. And then in verse 40, there's an interesting question. The Pharisees, they heard these things, and they ask, we're not blind too, are we? And Jesus says, since you say we see, your sin remains. Brethren, are we blind? Are we really blind? And also with that, have you ever thought about how Jesus saw? I look at number one here, the lens that we look through is right here. It's not your glasses, it's not, and I understand what you're saying, but this is the lens that we look through. And we have to. I want to see as Jesus sees, in that sense, what he saw. And Jesus sees this fellow one time, and he sees this, he doesn't see this desert-dwelling, camel hair-wearing, locust-eating man, does he? He sees a man who will prepare the way for the Messiah. And I have to ask, is this how we see? When you look at people, is that how you see? Jesus looked at the synagogue, for example, when he was 12 years old. And did he see just a bunch of stones and a building and a bunch of fellas, or what did he see? He saw an opportunity to interact with them, to teach. These fellas were 3 times his age. What did he see, though? And these were the fellas that would plot against him, that would hang him on a cross. Is that how we see? I was reading recently in about AD 245, there's this, that's when the Hippocratic Oath comes about, right? And it's through the Greeks. I actually think it was the Pythagoreans, but anyway, it initiated, and they had this, if you're going to be a doctor, then you needed to recite this, and this is the original Hippocratic Oath, and it basically amounts to that I will abstain, and they would repeat this, I will abstain from doing intentional harm to someone else, the do no harm, okay? I will abstain from doing any harm to anyone else. And then they go cut you open. But anyway, when we think about, is that what we see in other people? The do no harm, do we look at people and we like Jesus and say, I don't want to do any harm to anybody else. I don't want to say anything, as James talks about with the tongue. I don't want to even think things sometimes when we look at other people. So we have to look through this lens. And brethren, we do not, as Christians, have the license to blast someone on social media. Politically, whatever it is, we don't have the license to be unkind to other people. We do not, even in a text, or stating, sometimes, I'm just one who states my mind. We'll stop it if it's unkind. If it's unkind, we don't have the license to do that. So Luke 7, if you will, turn with me in Luke 7. Jesus, this is such a great text here. The city of Nain, you probably remember this story. It's about 20 or so miles southwest of Capernaum. And Jesus sees the hurt in others. And there's this multitude, I can't read through it, we don't have the time right now, but there's this multitude following Jesus and his disciples, and they're coming into this city here, this little town, and as he approaches the city, there's this dead man that's being carried out, the only son of his mother, it says. And there's a sizable crowd that's with her, and they're following this out. And imagine the difficulty here. This isn't just a woman and her son has passed on. This is the widow, and it's her only son, her only family. And I don't know about you, but when you see a funeral procession go by, and in our country it's a sign of respect to pull off the side of the road. It's still a sign of respect to do that. And I see people just as soon as they can, pull up, and we're people who are busy-minded, we're task-oriented, and yet everything stops, doesn't it? Traffic just lined up on the side of the road. Well, in their custom at that time, the Jewish custom, you would join in and you would walk with the family. That's what people, whatever they were doing, they would just start walking with the family. And I think how many times, we pull off the side of the road and task-minded, I got things to do, and I think about, I'm sorry in my heart that someone passed, and I think for a second, okay, back to work, gotta go. And it's like, and here is Jesus. And what's interesting about this story, here's a crowd following the woman here. Here's a crowd following, grieving an only son who will be resurrected. And you turn that direction around, and here's Jesus coming into town with a crowd. He's the only son who would die and be resurrected. It's interesting, the multi-directional there. And anyway, the next phrase of the text says, and when the Lord saw her. And I love that phrase. What do you see? When you see people, what do you see? Maybe we would have all stared at the cot or the bed or what did Jesus see? I want to see as Jesus does. The corpse wasn't laid in a coffin at that time, of course. They simply on an open cot, probably would wrapped in linen. And something else about the text that we've studied before, I believe it was in here, you didn't touch a corpse. You did not touch a corpse. And here Jesus does. And there was 3 individuals that we know of. You know, John says we don't know everything, but there was 3 individuals that we know of that were raised from the dead in the ministry of Christ. The young man here at Nain, the daughter of Jairus, and Lazarus. But let's get back into Luke 7 for just a second. He saw her. He had compassion on her. Is that too much for us? Is that too much for us to ask at times? You know, do you relate to that at all? And maybe we forgot we were the ones suffering. You remember John 3:16? For God so loved everyone. We were one time without Jesus. Do you see with eyes like Jesus? Do you have that compassion? And you know what we see today? I have just a little picture up here. I want to show you some of the things that we see with our eyes today. Well, I thought I did. Seeing as Jesus sees this way. We see people. We see wrinkles. We see gray hair. We see people that might, may not look as nice as you do, or maybe nicer, I don't know. We see people moving slow, moving fast. We see people who we think may or may not care about us. We see people sometimes and we think they're ignoring us, and we're like, oh, guess what? It's not about you. It has nothing to do with you. We see people, maybe they made the cut, or maybe they didn't. We invite specific people and they make the cut to come into our home. What would Jesus see? We see people based on what they make or their intelligence or their this or that, and maybe we judge people as less intelligent or more intelligent, or we see someone limping around and we think to ourselves, man, that's horrible. I'm glad it's not me. Well, it one day may be you. We see people and sometimes they're crying or they're off to the side and we think, boy, somebody needs to talk to them. Or maybe we see as this comic does here. Maybe you've seen this. 2 people writing, they're getting criticized. Then the woman's off the side and they're getting criticized. And then the man's off the side, they're getting criticized. And then they say, those idiots, they don't even know how to utilize the mule. That's really, that's how we see also. And it's sometimes, our perception of how people see, or it may not be. Just like the young preacher one time that was told, when you get older, you're going to be an amazing preacher. I can see it. And then when he gets older, they say, I bet you were good when you were younger. Our lens is skewed most of the time. It is. But if we could change our focus and see as Jesus sees, imagine that. We might notice here is a hated political leader, okay, or a hated political tax collector. And what did Jesus see? He saw Matthew. One that would be a disciple, a follower of him. Or we see even worse than that. Here is a rich, sinning chief tax collector. And Jesus here is Zacchaeus. And you know that story. Or we see in John 20, here's a man who doubts Thomas. And we call him Doubting Thomas. And he's plagued with that name. And we see him, I can't believe he had to see with his eyes and feel with his hands in order to believe. And Jesus sees at the end in John 20 and verse 28 where he says, my Lord and my God, and he makes a confession. What do you see? Or maybe you look at Luke 15 and here's Jesus and he's eating with sinners, and that's all they saw. I would say there are some here today who may see the same things. Maybe we see divorced and non-divorced, and that's it. Maybe we see perfect and we see imperfect. Maybe we associate with specific people, or maybe we even seclude ourselves from the ones who we think made poor decisions a long time ago. Is that what Jesus did? Jesus did not come for the healthy and the wealthy. And when he saw them as spiritually sick, he didn't just have an agenda to teach. It was to be with them. Maybe you saw an unclean woman suffering with a hemorrhage in Matthew 9. She's touching, how dare you touch Jesus, right? And Jesus says, your faith has made you well. And if we saw the crowds walking around Jesus, why are y'all bothering him? We might say, don't bother him. How often, brethren, do we have compassion and act on it? And that's really what the gist of this lesson is. It's not just to have compassion on somebody else, it's to act on that compassion. Did you know there's a huge difference? And I'm trying, this is for me first. I look at this, Matthew 9:36, seeing the compassion. He felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. I heard a woman, and several times we hear of people, their spouse struggled with Alzheimer's or struggled in this and that, and they're doing really maybe odd things, awkward things, and sometimes hateful things. And the statements that's made, I've heard this several times by the spouse is, they would never have done that if they had known what they were doing. Have you ever heard that statement? That person, they would never have known that. And then when someone today, brethren, is hateful or arrogant or prideful or malicious or whatever it is, we need to just say in our hearts, you know what, if they ever could really know what they really were doing, they probably wouldn't do that. What do you see in people? And on the flip side of that, have you seen Jesus? Somebody says, well, we can't see Jesus. I understand that. But have you seen Jesus? We see the song. We sing the song. That's what this series is going to be based off. We see the song. Have you seen Jesus, my Lord? Let me remind you of what he might see based on Matthew 25. And sing with me. I'm going to lead a song. I want you to sing with me. Have you ever stood in the family with the Lord there in your midst? Seen the face of Christ on your brother? Then I say you've seen Jesus my Lord. Have you seen Jesus my Lord? He's here in plain view. Take a look. Open your eyes. He'll show it to you. Maybe we see a young man struggling in the youth group. Can't get his feet on the ground. Struggling with his grades. Balancing maybe between a tough family. And yet Jesus sees in the distance a transformed life of a young man who may become a minister in the Lord's church. Maybe we see a poor older woman who's slow and moving slowly, and we're trying to get around her, but her prayers may be the warrior prayers that's moving the congregation along. And you see what's here. We just see like what's here, and Jesus sees what's here. And I'm challenging all of us not to just look at what we see, look at what Jesus sees. And we see a world that's falling apart and tearing apart and political and turmoil and all this, and Jesus sees opportunity. Be careful, brethren, that we don't become so enamored with everything's falling apart out there. It's horrible. Everywhere around us, and I want to say, don't get caught in the crossfire. Keep in mind who we are and the decision that we made. And do you realize in Matthew 9, he sees a people who were without a shepherd, like sheep without a shepherd. And in the next verse, he says, so give up. No. He could have said that. They're like sheep without, and think about how long this was ago. And here we are today. Do you still see people who are like sheep without a shepherd? And here we are today. And the message there in the text is this in Matthew 9. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. One of the strongest tests of our maturity, spiritual maturity, is the way we see people. Do you see your spouse as valuable? Do you see your children that you have with you? Do you see the compassionate eyes of Jesus? I talked about the hug lines coming up, but as we have someone come forward, do you see an opportunity to show compassion upon someone? Or do you just think to yourself, boy, I'm glad that people are showing compassion? Like I said, there's a difference. And the point is that this, all people matter to God. And we differentiate between this and that. All people matter to God. And maybe we get in the habit of looking through the devil's binoculars and seeing people that way. And maybe your eyes have been skewed into thinking revenge or retaliation or hatred. And maybe it's time that we all opened our eyes and thought about how Jesus sees. Or maybe this morning you need to go from darkness to light. Last Lord's Day, there were 3 individuals that obeyed the gospel. 3 individuals. If you haven't done that, maybe you're thinking about it. They were changed. The old was gone. The old way that they looked through a lens is gone. That old way is disappearing. The new has come, a new creation. Where are you in that? Are you looking through the right lenses this morning? And it's easy this time of year, and actually any time of year, to look down and to look negative and to look harsh on other people and to look completely opposite of what Jesus would look and how he would see. Maybe you need to make the decision this morning to flip that around and look through the lens as Jesus would see. And maybe, privately, if you want to talk or if you want to have a Bible study, Lane and I or Jared, I'll be in my office today from 5 to 6 maybe you want to talk about obeying the gospel. Maybe you want to sit down in more of a private setting instead of public. That's not the point. The point is when will you change and become more like Christ or become a child of his? If you need to do that, don't wait any longer. Today is the day of salvation. Maybe someone this morning is struggling. We'd be glad to be helpful to you, to pray with you, to show compassion on you, to wrap our arms around you. If you need to come to Christ, you can come right now as we stand and sing.